Hey Tim, it's another Friday. I can't believe how quickly these weeks are going by.
Oh, and even quicker every week. I'm surprised myself.
Well, why did you get us started? I know we wanted to talk about managing project changes one of these times. Why don't we do that this week?
When you start off, you learn about scope and you say, hey, we're going to protect scope at all costs. And then you start going through the project and somebody says, oh, don't worry, just change it. And you say to yourself and you say to eat everybody else, but I thought scope was something that I protected above everything. My mentor said, Tim, are you going to sacrifice your schedule for scope? Are you going to sacrifice your budget for scope? Are you going to sacrifice eating at home with your family every evening for scope? Let's be realistic. You change scope when it's appropriate. And I was thinking, okay, then what do I mean by appropriate? And that actually set me down the path of proper change management. When do I change it? And these terms, changing things on the project when appropriate and when necessary, were really head scratchers for me until I started seeing what the reason for a project manager is and what we have to consider as project managers.
No, that's entirely true. In fact, when we first were discussing this whole idea of change management, my mind immediately went to organizational change management. I'm thinking, how do I get the organization to change? But what we're really talking about for the benefit of our viewers is exactly what you just talked about. Is scope sacrosanct? And if it's not, what do we do about it? And how do we handle it? So maybe we should start with a definition of what is a change to a project and maybe what is change management.
Yeah, and that's difficult because it's hard to define the term change without including the word change in the definition. How would you define change?
Well, in my experience, which has been vast because I've been nailed by changes my entire career. But I think I look at it and there's probably, I'm thinking three, maybe four different ways that we can look at change. One, obviously, is if we're really solid in our project management maturity, we set up the whole risk process, all of that, so that we anticipate that change will come. And so we're ready for it. We don't necessarily know what those changes are, but we get ourselves mentally, our whole project gets that mindset that change can happen. But more importantly, and more often, we end up with a situation where change happens and we have to react to it because it came out of the blue. That tends to be for I'm going to say perhaps a less mature project management organization, because we should always be anticipating, but still things hit you out of the blue. And so a lot of times I think from that perspective, there's a request to make a change in either the requirements or the technology or the design or something that basically sends your entire schedule off track until you can bring it back by looking at how the change affects the project. There's a couple more, but I'm going to stop talking now and see if you have any other thoughts on this whole idea.
Yes, I do. I have too many thoughts. So
I know we could spend the whole thing just on this whole idea, right?
Yeah, on the definition of change. So let's step back to the big picture. The job of a project manager is to make sure the deliverable meets the objective, right? The team ensures that the requirements are met through their work and through the test and validation configuration management. They own the work of the project, and the project manager owns the management of that work, which means we own the management of not just doing the work and making sure it meets requirements, but what about quality and risk and all those other things, and the purpose of the project too. And if the purpose is not met, even though the deliverable may be complete, we're not looking at a good project. We're looking at project failure. So with that in mind, number one, anything that needs to have a modification in order for that project to be successful, is going to be called a necessary change. That's a modification to ensure success. Now, what you're talking about is the other side, minimizing failure.
Yeah.
And there are three ways that these type of changes can actually be brought into the project. Number one, formally, through formal change management that says, here's the template you use, here's the process, and we're going to make sure it doesn't break anything. We're going to make sure it makes things better. Number two, scope creep, and it's discovered. And I'd like to talk to you about scope creep. And then number three, necessary changes like constraints, enterprise environmental factors, and these things change, and the project must by necessity change as well.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back to what you were saying, when I said there's probably 4, maybe 5 different types of changes that we deal with, and I already kind of talked about anticipating, having that mindset of the fact that change does happen, especially on those longer projects. I also talked about the fact that we need to be able to react to change, because some of them come out of the blue. And I'll share an example with you later on from a legislative perspective. But what you just mentioned, and we talked about this a lot on our previous podcast, and that was to deal with scope creep. And that's what I would call sort of an incremental change. Now, in my experience, I've spent most of my career doing waterfall technology projects. And so therefore, when you set up your requirements, work on those, then you do your design work on those, then you do your development work on that. And then at some point, somebody on your team gets cozy with someone from the client's team and they say, let's make this change for the betterment of this whole project. And it sends us off on tangents and actually puts our entire schedule at risk. That's what I think we're talking about from a scope change point of view. And those are the kinds that we need to manage not to happen on projects. We need to formalize those changes.
And you're right. Number one, there's 3 factors you have to consider with change management, and scope creep. Number one, you have to be proactive and minimize it with establishing culture and process. Number two, you're going to have to be looking for unapproved changes constantly. And number three, before you undo that change, you need to run it through formal change control, because it would be horrible to say, nope, we didn't approve that change, take it out, and then test it and say, oh, that's a good change after all. That's duplication of work, and that's bad quality.
Yeah, and I've had situations where I've had a programmer, and completely innocently, completely client service oriented. They say, well, I know I have to develop this report, let's say. And the client says, I love that report, but can you add a whole crosstab section for me? And suddenly a 2-week report becomes a 4-week report because it happens, and that person starts to fall behind. So that's the whole part where we start to inculcate the idea of change management right down to our most neophyte team members, to make sure that they're always aware that any deviation can create a problem for the project and for our client, quite frankly.
Yeah, and if it's not controlled formally, you don't just have scope creep, you have schedule creep, cost creep, risk creep, and resource creep, and all of these things compound on each other.
Job hunting creep.
Exactly.
I just want to introduce one more, which probably doesn't come up as much when we think of change management, but a lot of times the reason that I got involved in projects where I had to bid them, to win them, to then develop and implement them, was because strategically the organization decided to put a change in place and therefore initiate the project in the first place. And that I would call maybe a strategic change management, but it's almost done before we as project managers get involved. But then it's our duty to make sure that that strategic change becomes exactly what the client is looking for.
And here's the thing that actually triggered me, that got me down this path of looking at change differently. change is why we have projects.
Yes.
Yeah, that's projects are an investment by decision makers to ensure we have a higher probability of a more than successful outcome by this investment. And if you look at it that way, changes the nature of all projects, not just agile projects.
Exactly. And I meant to say this before, but those that incremental change, the ones that often get involved from a or are the result of scope creep, Agile manages those beautifully, because every single sprint deals with a certain functional value to the organization, and what can't be fit in gets put in as backlog, and it's always being groomed. And so therefore, if someone wants to add a little bit of a tweak to a report or something, it's there in the backlog. But Agile, I'm learning this from you, Tim, Agile allows us to incrementally change things and keep things much more formal that way.
Yeah, exactly. It's a culture and a framework that allows you to actually handle change as it naturally occurs. Now, here's the thing. We talk about formal change management. Let's talk about traditional formal change management. I've been using that word, and I'd like to explore that whole concept. What are the things that you would include in a change management plan formally in order to have a more stable and a more reliable project?
Well, the very first thing I've done on my projects, or have worked with my own project management on, is from the get-go in the charter, whether it's the project charter or the team charter, we introduce the whole idea of this formal change process that then gets sort of exploded into a full change management plan. And in that formality, we make sure that, number one, the change is described well. So we actually create templates to introduce the change to the project team. So we make sure it's described well. We make sure we understand it fully so that we can estimate it completely. Often we have, I don't know of a time now where we don't have a change control board. And so all of the changes that come in get presented on a certain cadence to the change control board. And included in those are money estimates or scope estimates or schedule estimates in terms of deviations, whether we can bring in the scope or expand the scope. But all of that information is formalized such that the change control board, made up of both my team and the client team, can make a decision as to what can go forward, what should go forward, what can be left maybe for the future, that sort of thing. So it becomes a very deliberate description, estimation, and authorization process.
Indeed. Very good. There's some more steps that you look at. If you look in the project management body of knowledge, well, what we're looking at is the process group methodology here, and there's some things that they highlight as well that go along with what you're saying. Number one, documentation.
Documentation, yes.
See, here's the problem. When you dispense with your changes, you're going to have rejected and deferred changes. And if you don't have a change log, you're going to lose those.
Yeah.
The only changes that get a permanent recognition on your project are the approved ones, and they're placed into the work and the plan. But without that change log, you're going to lose all the things that you said no to. Second of all, there's, again, you talked about analysis and the determination. And, there's a couple steps you could do there. Number one, at a high level, is this change large enough? What's the size of the impact? Or is this change so minor that it's not going to do a lot? With that analysis alone, big or tiny, you can actually reject changes. And then finally, what are all the factors that change is going to impact? And that can take time.
Yeah. The beautiful thing about formalizing this and going back to kind of my description of where we actually create this template, a lot of the times the template is to gather all of the inputs into what causes that change or what would result in that change with some high level estimates, sometimes detailed estimates. But when we get authorized to actually implement the change, it's at that point that you're right. We do the documentation, we go through an entire life cycle for that change so that it is the formal document for the project itself, documentation for the project itself is updated with the change. We may be in testing at this point. We have to update our user test scripts. There's a whole lot of work. We may have to update training manuals, but all of that was put into the estimate before we ever got authorization so that we could go ahead and do that work. So yeah, it's formal and it's necessary and it's important. And it's, think about managing this afterwards in a maintenance and operations suite. We have to be able to go back in and see what that exact documentation looks like at all times.
And you're right. And there are two other major factors that we need to consider after the change is approved. Number one, according to Deming-Stewart with their Plan, Do, Check, Act, we need to go back and check and validate that that change is applied and it's working like we predicted.
Yep.
And then there has to be some communication. There's going to have to be some way of you saying to everyone, we had a change. This is why that change was approved. And here's how we are moving forward with that change as part of the project.
No, that is so important. In fact, when I mentioned before, when we first started this, there's change management. And then there's something more formal, something as formal called organizational change management. And so we need to also have those pieces in place so that these kinds of changes can be disseminated throughout the team or the organization or the client base or whoever it is. But absolutely. You also mentioned the Plan, Do, Check, Act. In check, there's also the quality aspect. I know we've talked about quality a lot on our podcasts, but we need to we don't want to rush these changes in. We don't want to push them in. We want to make sure every piece of documentation and every piece of code or configuration is quality.
See, you're totally right. Because if you're just looking at scope sign-off, if you're just looking at meeting requirements, you're looking at completeness. Did we do all the work? And without quality, you're not looking at correctness. And functionality oftentimes is contingent on how correct it is, not how complete it is. Like, did I follow all the safety guidelines? Did I follow all the laws and regulations that cover this work? That's we have to remember that, just chopping off the requirements and finishing them is not finishing the project.
Well, exactly. And then can you imagine even, let's say my company has a platform as a service or software as a service, and I just decide I'm going to upgrade my software for whatever, and I don't think of how it's going to affect my 1,000 clients. Can you imagine the chaos that I can cause by not taking that change into a very quality approach in terms of all of those things that we've been talking about to make sure that it's well thought out, well presented, and well implemented?
I live that experience both in a positive and in a negative manner every day. And you're right. This is a necessity. If we don't want to lose customers, if we want to maintain consistency, and if we don't want to face disruption, this stuff has to be taken seriously. And that's what I mean. And that's what I feel is the core of formal change management. It's in ensuring that there are no disruptions in what this thing is changing.
Absolutely. In fact, I want to go back to something you had said earlier too, that sometimes you end up with minor changes. What we have learned with our teams is that we bundle those minor changes and present them as a single change request to our change control board. And here's why, because even a I've been in situations where even the change of a label on a screen is important, because I, as a developer who presents that label change to my customer, may get the reaction from my customer that says, do you know what this is trying to say? This is doing the exact opposite meaning of what you're intending it to do. Had I not gone through a formal change process, that label would have caused all kinds of problems. I'm using an example to their customer base, because they would have taken the meaning differently than what it was intended. Because I may not know the nuances of the business like my customer does, who sits on the change control board. So even those minor change items are important to be brought before the change control board.
And these are stakeholders' priorities. This is
Yeah.
not our priorities. And that's, and you know, we're getting back to the people first concept, the voice of the customer. You know, that has to be integrated in with how we approach change.
So you and I are experienced project managers. We've been in a lot of projects, much like your opening gambit when you talked about the fact that, you know, to you scope, and to me scope, when in my early days, was sacred, was sacrosanct. Is it?
You know, it is to a point. Okay. If you have a specific requirement that must be in place for the project to be successful, that has to take a higher consideration than other requirements or other considerations. It has to. So there's prioritization in scope. You know, here are the critical requirements, here are the nice to have, and here we'll slip them in if they work requirements. You know, you have to have that you know, that must, should, could, and won't as your measuring device. And so when I say scope is sacrosanct, you know, in order for this project to be successful, this is why we have a scope statement saying we all agree this is what we call a successful project, and this is what we don't call a successful project. So throughout the project, that formal project management says, wait, we learned something here. We can make the project more successful. Or you say, wait, we learned here, if we leave this in our scope, the project's going to fail. So we have to have some formal approach to actually weed these things out.
And it's that formal approach that we talked about so eloquently before that goes into this, because I used to tell my teams when they'd ask me this question, you know, is scope is contractual, therefore is it changeable? And I'd say it is absolutely not changeable until it is.
Yeah. And again, when we talk about formal change management inside of contracts, we go up to an entirely different level of formality, because we don't just get the project stakeholders, you get the legal stakeholders involved with saying we have commitment and obligation here. And even then the scope might have to be changed, but it's going to take you 4 to 6 weeks, and it's going to take you signatures, and it's going to take more than just, you know, 2 project teams to agree on that change. Now that's all. It just is more formal.
It is. And let me give you an example from something that I went through in terms of, is scope sacred? And it is until it's not. I was working on a project with a very large team, both from my side and the client side, doing a project on the United States Medicaid eligibility. So Medicaid eligibility for an entire state, and all of the rules and all of the data and stuff that goes into Medicaid eligibility. Now, during this time, our people who had an ear to Washington were listening for something that was about to be passed, or maybe not, called the Affordable Care Act. Now, we could have put the entire project on hold while the Affordable Care Act either got passed in Congress or didn't get passed in Congress. It was one of those nail biters. Will it get passed or not? And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the Affordable Care Act changed much of what we were doing on this Medicaid eligibility system. Well, as it turns out, it did get passed. We had continued the project with what we knew would probably not change. When it got passed, we had this incredibly large change request. It was funded by the Medicaid people, but still, it was a large change request that we had to implement. We had to stop the project for a little bit in certain areas, figure out what the change was, and then begin the new process of implementing the Affordable Care Act. So, something that's a drastic change. That was a multi-million-dollar change, but you just don't know where change is coming from. And without that formal process, projects fail. How was that for a long explanation?
No, that's perfect. That's exactly perfect. And we have to have that ability because, again, a project is some type of investment, sometimes small, sometimes huge. And there has to be some return on that investment. And that's why we're there to ensure that that occurs. But at the same time, there are changes that have to happen in order for the project to, at least move forward, if not be successful. Now, here's the big question. And this is where we get into debates in my classes as well. What about the most major change you can have, which is the decision to close a project early? What's that like? And how do you make these decisions on these major projects to pull out or back out or archive the project?
I've probably witnessed that once in my career early on, and I wasn't in a leadership position, so I only got the whiff of that kind of, I'm speaking from experience now, not from, industry knowledge. So I kind of understood what was going on. The technology that the client had selected for the project that we were implementing turned out to not be a good fit. No matter how many times we went to the client and said, this isn't a good fit, they continued on until finally we couldn't continue on. We stopped that project. It was for the good of the organization. And I don't know if you remember from your MBA classes, but there's this concept of sunk costs. You can't get those back.
Right.
But
right.
no use chasing bad money with good money. So in that case, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but in that example, real life, we were able to kind of stop the bleed and allow the client to make a different decision.
Yeah. And you always start projects with good intentions and with a good direction and with good hope. And 2 times when I've seen projects closed early, it had to do with technology. One at the government level, with state government. The state government was intending to use this enterprise level business interchange framework, right? To allow agencies to share data in a very standard way. And within 1.5 years of the plan, they realized this wasn't going to work for this state. And so they had to call it even before the work started. But yeah, lots of money is invested and even laws had to be changed. So it took 2 years to back out of that project. And inside of corporations, it happens too. I was working with one portion of a sales group, right? The sales organization was broken up into 5 or 6 pieces. And this system didn't have a customer relationship management tool, CRM tool. So they didn't track their relationships. They weren't able to share in a collaborative way where they were interacting on an international standpoint. Well, that organization collapsed in another organization that had that software, and we were building that software for them. And so they didn't need it anymore. And so obviously, sunk cost or not, they weren't going to invest in this anymore. And so again, it was a good decision. There are good reasons for closing these projects early.
Yeah, and those won't affect your resume like pure failures do. Yes.
Well, and again, those are the career biters, the ones that you go against either policy or directive, or you go against common sense. And this is why older or more seasoned project managers take their time and really consider these things very carefully.
Well, and I've seen situations from afar, not been involved necessarily directly, but I've seen situations where, say, the CEO or the CIO or the project director was changed. And the new person coming in had an entirely different approach to what they wanted to see happen. And so again, sometimes they ended up closing down a project because it didn't fit their vision that they were bringing with them. So again, yes, there's sunk costs, but again, that's a good decision based on the fact that this particular executive has a whole different approach to taking the organization. So yeah, lots of good reasons to closing projects down early doesn't mean they're failures.
Right, exactly. There's another concept that I wanted to talk to you about that confuses a lot of my students: configuration management. How would you describe configuration management, and how does it help change?
Okay, so you're relating configuration management to change management. I guess I've always thought of it, and I'm going to narrow my definition. I know we can widen it, but let's begin this way. I'm going to narrow it to code and version control. That's how that's my earliest adoption of configuration management, was version control. Because every time you update software with defect fixes or whatever else, you want to make sure the new version goes into user acceptance testing and into the implemented system. And you need to always maintain that inventory to see where you were. Also maintain the previous several versions so that if you have to back something out, you can. So that's from a coding perspective. I know that's very narrow, but can we expand on that?
Yeah, in fact, we can. There's other things. The formal definition of configuration management says at any time in the project, you have to say, number one, the deliverable at its current state is able to function appropriately. And number two, that deliverable at any state, for that state it's in, has to also be consistent and operative. Consistent means it gives a repeated result. That's my precision and quality assurance. Operative means that it functions according to how it should function. So when you look at configuration management, it guarantees that. So it's your version control that says we're not looking at a previous version, we're looking at the current set. And there's two other things that we use in configuration management: our testing and our inspections. So we have validation and verification, and we also have our visual and observational abilities to say, yes, number one, it shows the same thing whenever it does what it's supposed to do every time. And number two, it's not just doing it, it's able to do it in a way that we predicted. It functions. It's going to work the same way when I move it into operations. And that's the purpose of configuration management.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And if I take it all the way back to even requirements, there's even version control of requirements, right? So you can.
There's two things I wanted to talk to about this, especially with change management. Number one, you can actually use configuration management to say, is this requirement good or not? And run it through your tests and inspections. And if it breaks, it's bad. Now, you can actually use configuration management to do the same thing with changes.
Absolutely.
And you can actually do this in a wireframe. And you can say, okay, let's walk this change through my configuration management. And if it breaks something, and we don't have to walk through it physically, we can walk through it as a verbal exercise, and we can say, oop, that's where it breaks. Okay, why does it break? Can we modify this change? Do we have to throw it out?
Yeah, and I remember reading one time, this goes probably back to my formal school years, even when we talked about configuration management. I remember it talked about the fact that you're also, through this whole idea of identifying and tracking and version control, you're actually protecting the deliverables or protecting the product or the asset for the organization against those unauthorized changes. So in fact, you're cataloging, you're doing all that, but there's that protection mode as well, where you really are maintaining control of those assets.
See, and this is where I think we misconstrue scope must stay the same.
Yeah.
The functionality and the repeatability must be demonstrated. And that's what configuration management is. And it's not just a project tool, it's an operational tool that allows us consistency, precision, and accuracy in our production, not just in our projects.
Well, and the beauty now, I mean, compared to when you and I started in project management versus now, there's so many neat tools that help in this whole process of configuration management, such that you almost can't mess up unless you don't configure the tool properly.
I remember one of my project management classes, and I was one of those silly people in the back that asked too many questions. And I asked my professor, what if we're putting our project management processes, not just the deliverable, under configuration? What does that do? And he just winked at me. And he said, yep, that's the appropriate use of configuration management, test inspections and version control that don't just have the deliverable protected, but also your project management protected as well.
So I'm going to ask you another question. There's a lot of projects now are being done with software done for you, kind of software out of a box, like all of the functionality comes with, all you have to do is tweak. You have to configure. Is there configuration management of configuration code? Or
if there it may or may not be out of the box. It may be part of the user manual, but this is something not just every project should consider, but every organization should consider. How do I actually put a container or a wrapper around this change such that I can guarantee at any point in its implementation, it's not going to disrupt? And boy, that's important for projects and project management.
Well, and the whole industry is pretty much changing to a CI/CD format. What is that? Continuous implementation, continuous development kind of format. If that's true, and I believe it is, the whole continuous nature implies you have to be so rigorous with your configuration management. Otherwise, you're always going to be slipping in some old version of something and then suddenly disrupt your end result. So,
and you know what better pairing than to have configuration management and change management working together. So you're making your changes and you're passing it through your configuration tests, and you're ensuring and you're demonstrating and you're validating. I tell you, if somebody can come up with some type of comprehensive environment that does this, we'll have something.
Well, and I think there's a lot of companies out there that are fairly close to it, if not already there. But there's always the human component where, if you don't configure your configurer correctly, you end up with those issues. So
exactly. That's beautiful. So here's another question that a lot of my students have. Do I need change management before the charter's approved?
Well, I would say if not before, certainly at the time of the charter. And again, I'm coming at it from a point that I made my living bidding on projects with my companies when I was
Right.
part of corporate America in bidding these things with software companies. When we bid to win, we put that change process right in our bid and actually created a change management plan as part of the bid so that when our contract was accepted, it was already there. When I wrote my project charter to work with my client, all I had to do was lift it from what was already approved in the contract. So yeah, it's never too early to implement formal change management in my
See,
mind.
this is the thing. This is the thing. There's a dichotomy that we're working with. We have on one side contracts which frame that work, and we have on the other side internal projects that have informal agreements that frame that work. And so under contracts, I agree with you totally. I agree with you totally. Now, with decisions that are informal inside of a company, I think that the PMBOK actually speaks to the nature a little better, where it says, as soon as you have your baselines, as soon as everybody agrees on scope, schedule, and cost, and this is what our target is, then you turn on formal change management.
That's interesting. You know, one of the things that I did, I'll often speak from the contract point of view because I was the companies that I worked for were fee for service. We went in, did the project, and left.
Right.
But one of the things that the companies that I worked for strived to do before they left was to leave a formal change management process in place so that when the internal IT organization took over the project from a maintenance and enhancement perspective, we still left them with the ability to formalize their agreements, IT versus their client, and they formalized those agreements such that they never made a change without formal presentation to their stakeholders. We weren't there anymore, but they continued that process. So yeah, it's never too early and it's never too formal.
Yeah, exactly. Contracts actually change that whole change management spectrum. And we could spend a whole show just on, how contracting changes the whole perspective of projects itself.
Contracts protect both sides of that equation. They
Right.
protect people doing the work from having scope creep out from underneath them, but they also protect the client organization that is accepting the software to know that whatever is being implemented as the final version is what they agreed to all along the way. So it's very protective of both sides.
Yep, that's right. We talk about this formality. So could you actually have informal change management on small projects? Is there ever a time where you can be not lackadaisical, but you don't have to be so tight and so firm? One of the things I think about is having a 6-week project and putting a huge process in place. The other I think about is just the nature of change in Agile as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because 6-week projects or 3-month projects you're right. You don't want to burden them with over obtrusive formalities. But I tell you what, a memo of understanding is a formality and it takes a lot less time than a full templated, estimated change control board version of the same thing. So even though formal change management may not be what people are looking at, it doesn't hurt to have memos of understanding between the parties to make sure that the change is agreed to.
And again, if you don't have a formal change management plan, having it as an understanding in the team charter, this is how we agree to manage change so we don't get in trouble.
Yeah. I mean, emails with copies to stakeholders is not a bad way to make sure that those even small changes get implemented correctly with their understanding.
So change in Agile, would you call that formal or would you call that informal?
The way that I've seen it implemented, and again, I'm not an Agile purveyor. I have been on a couple of projects with Agile. So the way I've seen it implemented makes sense to me as it's formal because there are certain ceremonies that are established. The first one being a refinement or a backlog refinement or a plan for this upcoming sprint, which means that not those things that don't get into the sprint to be implemented stay in a formal backlog that then gets looked at and groomed for another sprint. So yeah, I think change, even though it's incremental in Agile, I think it's very formal just through that ceremonial process.
Yeah, and let's do two more tests. One of the tests is plan, do, check, act. The Deming-Short cycle. Does change in Agile projects address plan, do, check, act?
The ones that I've seen do, you plan the sprint, plan, do, check out. You do the sprint. There's always a system test. And what we're doing on the project I'm on now is we're actually implementing a short formal user acceptance test in the sprint. Plan, do, check, act. And then if that sprint or if that program increment is good enough to be put into implement into the system, we then implement that. So that's the kind of the act, the final part where it's implemented. But yeah, I think it does. I think if you do it properly, it can be very formal and very effective.
Let's go through our multi-step formal change control we did in predictive too. Okay, in traditional project management. Agile, we have documentation. we have assessment.
Yep.
Let's hope through consensus and in our reviews and retrospectives, we have some form of approval, rejection, or deferral. We should have some form of applying that change and validating that change and communicating that change. So I don't see change as being any less formal in Agile than traditional. And again, it depends from project to project and how it's applied. But as defined, I don't see Agile change as any less formal than traditional project management change.
Yeah, I agree, perhaps with one exception, and that is where an organization decides to use Agile as its skunkworks process. And then they just kind of ram things through, try this, try this, try this. And skunkworks are very effective, but they can be very informal.
Yeah, they can be chaotic.
And
the problem is the investment in these pilots or sandboxes or skunkworks, whatever you want to call them, the return is just, I've seen the results as only as valuable as the way you invest into the experiments. That's the only caveat I would have in response to informality at that level.
Yeah, and the thing I like too about Agile is the projects that I've been on, towards the end of the sprint or at the end of the sprint, we've also done a demonstration with opportunity for feedback. And so that becomes almost the proof of concept of that piece of functionality. And the feedback, I love it when the clients, when the subject matter experts who are part of that feedback loop say, wait a minute, I know that's what I said, but that's not what I meant. And so
right.
And so but had they not seen the demo, that would not have been communicated. And so that piece of that change gets put back into the backlog and brought through to another sprint. So I love the formality of that aspect of Agile.
Yeah. It shortens the communication, and it also allows you for quick response.
Yeah,
which is beautiful.
Yeah, it is. And I came, I've said this 1,000 times on these podcasts, I came up through the ranks in waterfall or predictive methodology. And as much as we formalized or tried to formalize, things slipped through the crack because there was such a long time on some of these 3-4 year projects between requirements definition, between system design, then developing. By the time you went from a 6-month requirements definition to, a year later doing development, you may have changed personnel. Things no longer mean the same thing. So in many ways, the formality of Agile is more robust, gives you a better response than those long waterfall cycles.
That actually is good feedback, and that's going to give me something to think about over the next few months. Thank you for that. That was great.
Yeah, I mean, we try to put in things like gate reviews. Sort of at this gate we stop and we do a formal lessons learned and all the kinds of things. Are we ready to go into the next? But even at that, with those long cycles, the documentation had to be very, very good. And often the people who were documenting were not interested in the documentation as much as they should have been. So yeah, I mean, I would take a waterfall project anyway, because I'm familiar with that, but there are some definite downfalls in implementing that way.
Very good. Very good.
Hey, I have a question for you, Tim. If I'm a brand new or fairly new project manager listening to what you and I just talked about today, do we have a couple takeaways that they can go? I mean, everything we talked about is kind of like the, based on our combined experience, and it's over many, many years. But if I had a couple places for new project managers to start based on today's topic, what could a couple of those be?
Standardize your formal change management approach. And when you're building your plan, whether it's agile or predictive, consider the steps and how that changes your approach to managing that project. Second of all, change is not just rejection. Change is saying, is this necessary? Does this make the project better, or does it keep the project from falling apart? If you have a simple set of rules at a high level that allow you to sort out those changes, not dispense with them, not making the formal dispensation, but just get a sense of those change, it actually helps you as you go through the processes.
No, those are very good. I was going to add one from my experience when I was brand new, because I came up through the development ranks. I was an assembler programmer when I started. That's how long I've been around. But because I came through, when I became a team lead and then a project manager, often my change management was formalized around the whole analysis, design, development. And quite often I would forget about the testing aspects, the training changes, and those things cost time and money as well. And if you forget those, and the client says, wait a minute, I'm not paying any more just because you forgot something, it's a huge lesson learned. So one of the other takeaways, I think, is develop that checklist. Have a checklist. Have I done this? Oh, I better make sure I do this. So it goes along with your formalized change process.
Having templates. And it's not finding the perfect templates. It's finding a template that gives you a good start that you personally can refine as you go forward.
Yeah, and that you use. I've seen a lot of templates on shelves.
Yeah, exactly.
And not necessarily implemented. So, hey, this has been great. I love this conversation.
Yeah, this was a good one this week. It's always a great topic with my students, and I knew we'd have fun today with this. If we have any more questions about change or just general project management, where can we reach out and ask you?
We say this every week, right? Find us on LinkedIn, because I tell you what, I still haven't got this fully, and I've been at this for many, many decades. So if I can have someone connect with me on LinkedIn and help me understand even more, or ask questions, that's great. Merv Jersak on LinkedIn.
And it's the same way with me over at LinkedIn. And again, see, when you ask me a question, and Merv's the same way, if you ask me a question and if I can't answer it, it's an opportunity for us to learn with you, and we will find the answer. And that's the joy. Even after 30 or 40 years of project management, there's still 90% of it more to explore.
Well, I think part of that is because we are on LinkedIn and we do keep learning and trying to stay with the changes. I don't know anybody who's gotten into Pinbox 7 as much as you have, and you're not necessarily active on a project that you're implementing for a customer right now, and yet you're still in Pinbox 7. So, that's the kind of things that we bring to this conversation, that we're always trying to stay abreast with what's going on in the world of IT project management.
Very good. Very good. Yes. Thanks again.
Maybe we should do a podcast at some point, Tim, on how project managers can also have downtime.
Work-life balance? What's
Yeah,
that?
work-life
Yeah,
balance.
I'd like that. I'd like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks again, Merv, and thanks everyone for tuning in.